cloying, meticulously cultivated sweetness of the late spring azaleas, a scent that usually hung like an oppressive, perfumed blanket over the pristine, almost sterile avenues of goldenrod estates, was today pierced by something far more primal, the raw, metallic tang of pure, unadulterated fear, and the suffocating, invisible miasma of injustice. Simone Dubois, the state's attorney for civil rights, had been attempting with a grim sort of determination to engage in that rarest of weekend rituals, a Saturday morning jog. Her doctor, a no-nonsense woman who despaired of Simone's stress levels and caffeine intake, had prescribed less courtroom, more chlorophyll. Thus, Simone found herself on the public jogging path that snaked almost apologetically along the periphery of Goldenrod Estates, a ridiculously opulent gated community that seemed to view the outside world with a mixture of disdain and suspicion. She usually preferred the unapologetic grit and vibrant chaos of the city parks near her downtown apartment, but she was trying to be a compliant patient. Nature, or perhaps a more cynical human intervention, clearly had other intentions for her morning. As she rounded a bend, shaded by an ostentatious line of perfectly sculpted Japanese maples, a sudden panicked shout, followed by a series of strangled, desperate gasping sounds, sliced through the manufactured tranquility like a shard of broken glass. Simone's head, attuned by years of deciphering the subtle tells of deceit in witness testimonies and the carefully coded language of systemic discrimination, snapped up. Her runner's pace faltered, then stopped. Her eyes, accustomed to dissecting the anatomy of injustice, immediately locked onto a horrifying, almost surreal tableau, unfolding not 50 yards away, just inside the ornate, imposing wrought iron gates of Goldenrod Estates. A uniformed private security officer, a hulking, red-faced man whose authority seemed as overinflated and ill-fitting as his tightly buttoned navy blue shirt, was engaged in a violent, one-sided struggle with a black teenager. The boy, slender and clearly terrified, his limbs flailing with a desperate, uncoordinated energy, was clutching his chest, his breath tearing from his lungs in ragged, shallow heaves, his face a rapidly darkening mask of acute panic and profound oxygen hunger. He was, to Simone's experienced eye, unmistakably in the throes of a severe medical crisis. "Stop resisting, you little punk!" The officer, whose tarnished brass name tag, even from this distance, seemed to sneer G. Keller Senior Patrol, bellowed his voice a gravelly, aggressive assertion of absolute dominance. "I said put your hands behind your back. You think you can just come in here because of disturbance in my neighborhood and get away with it." He punctuated his furious words by violently slamming the boy hard and repeatedly against the meticulously tended, unyielding privet hedge that lined the grand entranceway. The boy let out a choked, guttural cry, a sound of pure agony and terror, his already weakening struggles becoming more spastic, less coherent. A disturbance. The only disturbance Simone could perceive was Officer Keller's brutal, unconscionable, and potentially lethal assault on a child who was very clearly fighting for his next breath. The boy wasn't resisting. He was suffocating, drowning in plain sight on a sun-dappled suburban morning. The central sickening and instantly clarifying question that obliterated any lingering thoughts of serene nature, walks, or doctor-prescribed stress relief was not merely what had provoked this monstrous display of unrestrained force, but how, as the state's chief enforcer of civil rights, sworn to uphold the Constitution and protect the vulnerable, she was going to tear down the gilded gates of this privileged enclave and bring the full, unyielding weight of justice to bear upon the perpetrators of this unfolding public atrocity. This wasn't just an assault, she realized, with a surge of cold-focused rage. This was a visceral public lynching of a child's fundamental right to breathe, to exist, to be safe, all being enacted under the counterfeit badge and presumed authority of a homeowners association. Simone Dubois' professional life was a relentless, often thankless crusade against the hydra-headed monsters of discrimination, inequality, entrenched prejudice, and the myriad abuses of power that flourished in the shadowed corners of society. As the state attorney for civil rights, a division, she had personally resurrected from bureaucratic obscurity and painstakingly transformed into a formidable, nationally respected prosecutorial force, Her days were a volatile, unpredictable amalgam of complex high-stakes litigation, painstaking, often politically explosive investigations into systemic injustices, impassioned, evidence-laden advocacy before often skeptical legislative committees, and tense, frequently fraught, closed-door negotiations with powerful, well-funded institutions far too comfortable with the insidious inertia of the status quo. She was a formidable courtroom tactician, her legal arguments as sharp and unyielding as tempered steel, her cross-examinations legendary within the state bar for their uncanny ability to dismantle carefully constructed falsehoods and expose the rotten core of deceit. Her commitment to the foundational principles of civil rights was not merely a professional mandate articulated in dusty legal statutes. It was a deeply personal, almost spiritual calling, an unquenchable fire, forged in the crucible of her own lived experiences as a Black woman who had navigated and systematically overcome a lifetime of subtle and not so subtle barriers, prejudices, and outright acts of discrimination. She had recently and very publicly concluded a landmark 2-year investigation into patterns of racial profiling, excessive force, and discriminatory policing within several of the state's largest municipal police departments, an investigation that had culminated in hard-fought court-enforced consent decrees mandating significant systemic reforms. That case had been politically fraught, attracting vicious personal attacks and veiled threats, but legally unassailable, and it had further solidified her reputation, both lauded and feared as a prosecutor who would not flinch, would not yield in holding even uniformed, state-sanctioned officials accountable when they transgressed the sacred boundaries of the law and violated the constitutional rights of the citizens they were sworn to protect. The insidious, largely unregulated creep of quasi-law enforcement powers being arrogantly wielded by poorly trained, often unaccountable private security forces, particularly within affluent exclusionary HOAs like Goldenrod Estates, was a burgeoning concern. She had been closely monitoring a dangerous legal gray area ripe for abuse. Jamal Carter, the 15-year-old boy now desperately fighting for air and for his life under Officer Keller's crushing indifferent weight, was ironically a resident of Goldenrod Estates, though one who often felt like an unwelcome, barely tolerated guest in his own neighborhood. The Carters, David a respected software engineer at a local tech firm, Maria a dedicated and beloved elementary school teacher, and Jamal their only child, were one of only 3 Black families within the sprawling, predominantly white and aggressively homogeneous enclave. This demographic distinction, while not openly commented upon in the carefully polite, if often strained social interactions of Goldenrod Estates, had not gone unnoticed by some of its more traditionalist and vocally prejudiced residents. Jamal was by all accounts a bright, introspective, and exceptionally talented teenager. He was a gifted artist with a particular passion for creating intricate graphic novels, his characters often imbued with a quiet heroism and a profound sense of justice that seemed to mirror his own gentle, thoughtful demeanor. He also lived with severe chronic asthma, a condition that had cast a long shadow over his childhood, requiring him to be ever vigilant about potential environmental triggers, dust pollen, chemical fumes, extreme temperatures, and to always, without exception, carry his emergency albuterol inhaler. Despite this constant underlying health challenge, Jamal was an active, engaged young man, a straight-A student at the local high school, a valued member of the debate club, and well-liked by his peers for his quick wit and his quiet, unassuming kindness. His parents had made the difficult decision to move to Goldenrod Estates 3 years prior, despite their misgivings about its reputation for social rigidity, lured primarily by the promise of its nationally ranked public schools and its proximity to a renowned pediatric pulmonary clinic that offered specialized care for Jamal's complex asthma. They had quickly discovered, however, that the community's glossy brochures promising safety, serenity, and unparalleled quality of life came with a series of unspoken and sometimes overtly stated caveats and expectations. Safety and welcome, it seemed, were conditional, often dependent on conforming to the unwritten and frequently discriminatory social codes and aesthetic preferences of the community's powerful and deeply entrenched Homeowners Association, an organization effectively ruled by its imperious, iron-willed president, Ms. Eleanor Vance. Vance, a woman whose pronouncements on maintaining the unique character of our neighborhood and upholding our exacting property values often carried thinly veiled but unmistakably clear racial and classist undertones, had made it abundantly clear through a series of carefully orchestrated microaggressions pointedly exclusionary social invitations, and passive-aggressive complaints about everything from the Carters' excessively vibrant taste in garden flowers to the inappropriate volume of the jazz music Jamal sometimes played in his room that she considered the Carters, and particularly their son, to be not quite the right demographic fit for the pristine, carefully curated paradise of Goldenrod Estates. Officer Gary Keller, badge number 007, a designation he wore with an unearned, almost comical sense of self-importance, was the physical manifestation, the blunt, unthinking instrument of Ms. Vance's exclusionary vision for Goldenrod Estates. A former mall security guard whose employment history was littered with a string of complaints alleging aggressive behavior, racial profiling, and unnecessary use of force, complaints that had somehow never resulted in any meaningful disciplinary action. Keller had found his true calling, his perfect niche in the less scrutinized, more autonomous realm of private HOA security. He patrolled the meticulously manicured streets and pathways of Goldenrod Estates with a zealot's fervent dedication. His interactions with residents, especially teenagers, people of color, and anyone else he deemed out of place or disrespectful of community standards, frequently characterized by unwarranted suspicion, overt intimidation, and an almost gleeful overeagerness to assert his dubious HOA-conferred authority. He was, in essence, Ms. Vance's private enforcer, her uniformed attack dog, tasked with maintaining her preferred social order and swiftly neutralizing any perceived threats to the community's fragile, artificial tranquility. The inciting incident, the seemingly innocuous everyday event that had catastrophically triggered Officer Keller's violent prejudiced overreaction and Jamal Carter's subsequent life-threatening asthma attack, had been by any rational measure utterly unremarkable. Jamal, on that bright, deceptively peaceful Saturday morning, was simply walking home from a nearby friend's house where they had been collaborating on a school history project. He had opted to take a familiar shortcut across a small, rarely used community green space, a pleasant, tree-shaded patch of grass he had traversed countless times without incident. That particular morning, however, a crew of landscapers contracted by the Goldenrod Estates, HOA, had been aggressively spraying a potent chemical pesticide on a neighboring section of ornamental shrubbery, a task they were performing, as was later determined, without posting any of the required warning signs or taking adequate precautions to prevent drift. A sudden, unexpected gust of wind had carried a dense, acrid cloud of the chemical fumes directly into Jamal's path. The effect on his hypersensitive lungs was instantaneous and terrifying. His chest seized as if caught in an iron vise, his airway constricted violently, and he began to cough a harsh racking sound that quickly escalated into a desperate, frightening struggle for breath. He fumbled frantically in his backpack for his life-saving albuterol inhaler, his fingers clumsy with burgeoning panic. It was at that precise moment of acute, overwhelming medical distress, as Jamal, disoriented by hypoxia, his vision beginning to tunnel, his lungs burning with an agonizing fire, stumbled towards a nearby park bench, desperate for a place to sit, to concentrate, to get the medication into his starving lungs, that Officer Keller, his ubiquitous security golf cart appearing as if from nowhere, had spotted him. To Keller's jaundiced, prejudiced eyes, a black teenager gasping for air, unsteady on his feet, clutching his chest in an affluent, predominantly white neighborhood, did not register as a child in the throes of a medical crisis. He registered instantly and unequivocally as suspicious, as probably high on drugs, as a potential threat to public order. Duh. Hey you, yeah you kid, what do you think you're doing over there? Keller had bellowed his voice, a harsh accusatory bark, as he leaped with surprising agility from his golf cart. His hand reflexively, almost instinctively, going to the bulky pepper spray canister prominently displayed on his oversized, creaking utility belt. You don't look like you belong around here, boy. What are you on? What's in that backpack? Jamal, his world narrowing to the desperate, agonizing fight for each precious molecule of air. His lungs feeling as if they were filled with crushed glass, had tried to speak, to explain his plight, to show Keller his inhaler. But only a series of strangled, wheezing gasps emerged, each one a monumental effort. He pointed frantically towards his chest, then towards his backpack, his eyes wide with a terror that Keller, in his profound ignorance and ingrained bigotry, utterly failed to comprehend. Keller interpreting Jamal's desperate gestures not as a plea for urgent medical help, but as furtive movements, as refusal to comply, as clear evidence of guilt, had immediately catastrophically escalated the encounter. "Don't you move another muscle, you hear me?" Keller had roared, his face contorting with suspicion and aggression. "I see you reaching for something in that bag. You put your hands up where I can see them right now, or I swear you'll regret it." He had then lunged at Jamal, grabbing him by the arm, spinning him around with brutal force, initiating the violent, life-threatening, and utterly unconscionable confrontation that Simone Dubois, her morning jog, forgotten her senses already on high alert, was now witnessing with a mounting, sickening sense of horror and cold prosecutorial fury. The first shocking, almost unbelievable wave of the rising action was the brutal, unconscionable escalation of physical force by Officer Keller against a child who was clearly desperately in the throes of a severe life-threatening medical emergency. As Simone, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, sprinted towards the unfolding scene, her mind already rapidly cataloging a litany of potential state and federal civil rights violations, Keller, with a grunt of exertion and a snarl of contempt, wrestled Jamal Carter to the meticulously manicured grass. He pinned the boy face down his substantial knee, digging cruelly and deliberately into the delicate bones of Jamal's upper back, further compromising his already desperate failing attempts to draw a breath. Jamal's precious albuterol inhaler, which he had managed with his last ounce of strength to pull from his backpack, clattered onto the hard, unforgiving pavement of the nearby walkway, just agonizingly out of his weakening reach. "Stop faking it, you little druggie." Keller snarled, his voice thick with a venomous, racially charged disdain as he yanked Jamal's slender arms violently behind him, preparing to apply handcuffs. "I know your type, trying to cause trouble in a decent neighborhood, then pretending you're sick as a dog when you get caught. It ain't gonna work with me, kid." "Stop, for God's sake, he can't breathe." Simone shouted, her voice a raw, urgent command that for a fleeting microsecond momentarily startled Keller, causing him to look up from his victim. "He's having a severe asthma attack. You need to get off him. Call 911 immediately." She consciously, deliberately identified herself only as an attorney at this initial stage, strategically withholding her full formidable title for the moment, wanting to accurately assess the unvarnished nature of Keller's response to even a basic civilian challenge to his perceived authority, to gauge the depth of his arrogance and the limits, if any, of his presumed impunity. Keller, his face flushed a deep, angry crimson, his eyes narrowed into slits of belligerent self-importance, glanced at Simone with a look of utter contemptuous dismissal. "This is official Goldenrod Estates security business, lady." He spat his breath, smelling faintly of stale coffee and cheap cigars. This young punk was observed acting suspiciously, possibly under the influence of narcotics, and then he actively resisted when I lawfully attempted to question him. "I've got this situation completely under control. I suggest you just butt out and mind your own damn business unless you want to find yourself charged with interfering with a peace officer in the lawful performance of his official duties." He then, with another brutal grunt of effort and a sickening crack that Simone prayed wasn't bone-hauled, Jamal roughly to his feet, one arm still painfully torqued behind the boy's back in an improper, dangerous hold, and began dragging him stumbling and half-conscious towards his waiting security golf cart. The life-saving inhaler lay abandoned, glinting mockingly in the bright morning sun on the indifferent pavement. The blatant, callous disregard for Jamal's obviously life-threatening medical condition. Officer Keller's cruel, demeaning taunts, his immediate reflexive leap to a worst-case, racially charged and utterly baseless interpretation of Jamal's distress, and his arrogant, contemptuous dismissal of Simone's urgent attempt to intervene, all combined to create a scene of shocking, almost surreal, and unpardonable brutality. The second shocking and potentially fatal stage of the rising action commenced as Officer Keller, after casting a final triumphant sneer in Simone's direction, roughly shoved Jamal Carter into the passenger seat of his golf cart and sped off with a screech of tires on the pristine asphalt, presumably towards the Goldenrod Estates Public Safety Building, another of the HOA's ridiculously grandiose and misleading misnomers for its cramped, poorly ventilated security shed located in the basement of the community clubhouse. He was in effect, and in clear violation of numerous state and federal laws, abducting a critically ill minor under the ludicrous, transparently false pretext of enforcing vaguely defined HOA regulations. Jamal, his face now a terrifying shade of dusky, cyanotic gray, was slumped inertly against the seat, his breathing alarmingly shallow and irregular, his eyes beginning to roll back into his head, a faint, frothy saliva flecking his lips. Simone, her heart pounding with a potent, terrifying mixture of cold professional fury and a desperate, almost maternal sense of urgency, immediately dialed 911 on her cell phone. Her voice, when she spoke to the emergency dispatcher, was crisp, authoritative, and utterly devoid of panic, a prosecutor laying out the undeniable facts of a heinous crime in progress. She reported an aggravated assault, an unlawful imprisonment, and a deliberate denial of emergency medical care by a named HOA security officer, Gary Keller, providing his physical description, his badge number, which she had seared into her memory, and the direction in which he had taken Jamal. She requested immediate priority dispatch of paramedics and local police units to the Goldenrod Estate's main gate, repeatedly forcefully emphasizing the critical, life-threatening nature of Jamal Carter's medical condition. Her next call, even before the 911 dispatcher had finished confirming the details, was to her own office, a direct line to her chief deputy for special prosecutions and civil rights enforcement, David Ramirez. "David," she said, her voice tight with a controlled rage that was far more terrifying than any shouted outburst. "This is Simone. I am currently on scene at the Goldenrod Estates Homeowners Association in Fairfax County. I have personally witnessed a private HOA security officer, one Gary Keller, commit a violent, unprovoked assault and subsequent unlawful detention of a juvenile black male, Jamal Carter, who is, as we speak, experiencing a severe, life-threatening asthma attack. Keller is actively, deliberately denying this child access to his emergency medication and to any form of medical care. I need you to initiate a full Civil Rights Division emergency response protocol immediately. Alert our FBI liaison. I want a federal presence here yesterday. Get Assistant U.S. Attorney Laura Chen, our lead on police misconduct and color of law violations, on the line for me. This is going to be a major federal civil rights case. I am on scene. I will be the primary complainant and the primary witness. Move David, now." As the first wail of approaching sirens began to pierce the deceptive tranquility of Goldenrod Estates, Simone, her mind already working with the speed and precision of a seasoned trial lawyer, mapping out her prosecution strategy, raced in her own car towards the HOA's main administrative building and clubhouse, where she correctly assumed Keller would have taken Jamal. She arrived just as Keller, with considerable difficulty, was attempting to drag the now barely conscious, almost completely unresponsive teenager out of the golf cart and into a small, windowless, cinder block office, ominously marked "Security, Authorized Personnel Only." It was at that precise, critical juncture that Ms. Eleanor Vance, the formidable, universally feared, and notoriously autocratic president of the Goldenrod Estates Homeowners Association, emerged with regal displeasure from the clubhouse's main entrance, her perfectly coiffed silver hair glinting in the morning sun, her expression one of icy, profound annoyance. Rather than expressing a shred of human concern for the obviously dying child being brutalized on her doorstep, or questioning Officer Keller's patently outrageous and violent handling of the situation, Ms. Vance, her eyes like chips of Arctic ice, immediately rounded on Simone Dubois. "And just who in the world might you be, madam?" Ms. Vance demanded, her voice dripping with a potent combination of condescension and affronted privilege, to be causing such an unseemly commotion on private Goldenrod Estates property, and more importantly, to be interfering with our chief of security in the lawful, and I assure you, necessary execution of his duties. My name." Simone stated, her voice quiet but resonant with an authority that seemed to suck the very air from around them, her eyes locking with Ms. Vance's in a silent, unblinking battle of wills. "Is Simone Dubois, and I am the state's attorney for civil rights, your chief of security. Ms. Vance has just committed multiple serious felonies, including but not limited to the aggravated assault and unlawful imprisonment of a minor child, Jamal Carter, who is, as you can plainly see, if you bother to look, in acute, life-threatening respiratory distress. Your officer is actively and with apparent malice denying that child access to his life-saving medication and to any form of emergency medical care. Unless you wish to find yourself charged with conspiracy to commit these crimes, and as an accessory after the fact, I strongly, urgently suggest that you instruct Officer Keller to immediately release Jamal Carter into my custody and to allow the paramedics who are arriving as we speak to treat him without any further delay or obstruction. The open, arrogant, almost breathtaking complicity of the Homeowners Association president in condoning and now actively attempting to justify Officer Keller's potentially lethal actions. Her immediate reflexive attempt to intimidate and obstruct a high-ranking state law enforcement official engaged in the lawful performance of her duties was a shocking, almost unbelievable display of unchecked insular power and profound, perhaps even criminal moral bankruptcy. The midpoint twist, the irrefutable game-changing piece of evidence that would rip away any lingering shred of plausible deniability from Officer Keller and the entire Goldenrod Estates HOA leadership and expose the raw, ugly, discriminatory undercurrent that had clearly fueled their outrageous actions, came from an unexpected, almost miraculously courageous source. As the newly arrived paramedics, their faces grim with professional concern, finally gained access to Jamal, after a tense, near-physical standoff between Simone and a still obstructive Ms. Vance, and began working frantically to stabilize his breathing with a high-flow oxygen mask, a nebulizer treatment, and emergency IV medications, and as local police officers, now visibly uncomfortable, intimidated, and increasingly deferential in Simone Dubois' formidable, unwavering presence, began to formally question a suddenly less confident, almost bewildered Officer Keller, a young woman, a Latina nanny named Isabella Rodriguez, who was employed by one of the Goldenrod Estates families, timidly, nervously approached Simone. She was clutching her cell phone in a white-knuckled grip, her hand shaking so violently that the phone itself seemed to vibrate. "Ms. Dubois, ma'am." Isabella whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and civic duty, darting nervously towards Officer Keller and Ms. Vance, who was now engaged in a heated, low-voiced, and clearly losing argument with the ranking police sergeant on scene. I saw the whole thing, ma'am. From the park where I was with little Timmy. I filmed it all, on my phone." Simone felt a sudden, sharp surge of adrenaline, the unmistakable, visceral instinct of a seasoned prosecutor who knows with absolute certainty that she has just been handed the evidentiary key that will unlock a deeply buried, carefully concealed, and profoundly ugly truth. "Miss Rodriguez," Simone said, her voice gentle but firm, her eyes conveying a reassurance she hoped the young woman could feel. "May I please see that video?" Isabella nodded, her lower lip trembling, and with quick, fumbling fingers, she transferred the video file to Simone's secure department-issued smartphone. The footage, when Simone played it back a few moments later, in the relative privacy of her own car, was even more horrifyingly clear, more damningly explicit than she could have possibly imagined. It began with Jamal Carter, clearly in distress, stumbling, gasping for breath, desperately fumbling in his backpack for his inhaler. It captured Officer Keller's aggressive, almost predatory approach, his immediate baseless accusations, his contemptuous, sneering dismissal of Jamal's increasingly desperate attempts to explain his medical emergency. It showed Keller, his face contorted in a mask of racist disdain, sneering the words, "What's wrong, boy? Having a little trouble handling your crack cocaine today, are we?" as Jamal wheezed his eyes, pleading for help. It then, with sickening clarity, showed Officer Keller deliberately, almost casually, kicking Jamal's dropped albuterol inhaler further away, a small, gratuitous, almost balletic act of calculated sadistic malice. And then the video documented in excruciating, unsparing detail the brutal takedown, Keller's knee grinding into Jamal's back, Jamal's desperate, choked cries for help, his face pressed into the unforgiving grass, contorted in a mask of pure terror and rapidly advancing oxygen starvation. The video was far more than just irrefutable evidence of Keller's excessive, unwarranted force. It was a sickening, unvarnished, and profoundly disturbing depiction of explicitly racially motivated cruelty of a man cloaked in the counterfeit authority of an HOA uniform, deliberately and sadistically tormenting and nearly killing a vulnerable disabled child during a life-threatening medical emergency. The twist, the pivotal moment that transformed this case from one of potentially catastrophic gross negligence and outrageous abuse of power into a clear, unequivocally prosecutable hate crime, a profound and malicious violation of Jamal Carter's most fundamental federally protected civil rights, was contained in those horrifying digital seconds. And it implicated Ms. Eleanor Vance, even more deeply for her subsequent frantic actions to protect Keller, now viewed through the damning lens of this video, reeked not just of poor judgment, but of a desperate, conscious attempt to cover up not merely an employee's egregious misconduct, but a pervasive, poisonous, and institutionally sanctioned culture of racial discrimination and intolerance that she herself had meticulously cultivated and ruthlessly enforced within the gilded gated walls of Goldenrod Estates. The climax of this rapidly escalating, now federally significant confrontation with entrenched power, virulent prejudice, and institutional corruption unfolded not in a public courtroom, not yet, but in the sterile, coldly impersonal, and suddenly very tense conference room of the Goldenrod Estates Administrative Building. An emergency closed-door and supposedly strictly confidential HOA board meeting had been hastily, almost frantically convened at Ms. Eleanor Vance's increasingly desperate insistence, ostensibly to address the unfortunate and regrettable incident involving Mr. Jamal Carter, and to formulate an appropriate community response to the unwarranted and frankly unprofessional interference by certain outside agencies. Simone Dubois, however, had other far more definitive plans for their agenda. Accompanied by the local chief of police, a man now thoroughly chastened, deeply embarrassed by his department's initial deference to the HOA, and almost pathetically eager to cooperate with state and federal authorities, two of her most senior and formidable investigators from the State Civil Rights Division, and significantly, two quietly imposing, impeccably dressed special agents from the FBI's Washington field office, whom Simone had, with a single discreet phone call, requested for urgent federal civil rights consultation and potential joint investigation. She calmly, but decisively, entered the HOA board meeting uninvited, unannounced, and utterly unintimidated. The expressions on the faces of Ms. Eleanor Vance and the 6 other expensively attired, self-importantly indignant Goldenrod Estates HOA board members shifted almost comically from smug conspiratorial self-assurance to stunned disbelieving and rapidly dawning apprehension. Ms. Vance, ladies and gentlemen of the board, Simone began, her voice devoid of any discernible heat, but resonating with an unshakable, almost palpable authority that seemed to suck the very oxygen from the room. I trust you are all now at least superficially aware of the series of unfortunate events that transpired on your property this morning, events involving young Jamal Carter and your now former employee, Officer Gary Keller. What you may not yet be fully aware of. She paused, her piercing gaze, sweeping deliberately individually across their increasingly uncomfortable, rapidly paling faces, is the full, formidable, and frankly terrifying extent of the numerous state and potentially federal laws that have been egregiously violated here today, not just by Officer Keller in his individual capacity, but quite possibly by this homeowners association as a corporate entity and by its leadership both collectively and individually. She then, with the chilling precision of a master surgeon, dissecting a diseased organ, proceeded to lay out in excruciating, legally precise detail the formidable array of potential criminal charges they were now facing: aggravated assault with bodily harm, reckless endangerment of a minor unlawful imprisonment, intentional infliction of severe emotional distress, and most significantly and ominously, multiple violations of state and federal civil rights statutes, including but not limited to conspiracy to interfere with federally protected rights and specific hate crime provisions, given the newly acquired irrefutable evidence of Officer Keller's explicit racial animus and his deliberate sadistic cruelty. She then, with a subtle nod to one of her investigators, signaled for the room's lights to be dimmed. The investigator smoothly connected a small encrypted projector to the large wall-mounted conference room television screen. The bystander's cell phone video, raw, unedited, and utterly damning, filled the screen. The grainy but horrifyingly clear images of Officer Keller's brutal, unprovoked assault on Jamal Carter, his vicious racist taunts, his deliberate, almost casual kicking away of the life-saving inhaler played out in agonizing, sickening detail. Gasps, then a series of shocked, horrified, and in some cases physically nauseated silences emanated from the previously complacent board members. Ms. Eleanor Vance's carefully constructed facade of haughty, untouchable defiance had completely irrevocably crumpled. Her face, just moments before a mask of arrogant indignation, was now a pasty, slack-jawed, almost grotesque caricature of itself, her eyes darting wildly around the room as if seeking an escape that clearly did not exist. Officer Gary Keller, who had been brought into the room by local police officers and was standing sullenly, defiantly in a corner, visibly flinched, his own bravado evaporating like mist in a harsh sun as his own cruel, hate-filled words echoed back at him from the television speakers amplified in the suddenly tomb-like silence of the conference room. "That video, ladies and gentlemen of this board," Simone continued, her voice as cold and sharp as a shard of ice as the room's lights slowly came back up, illuminating their stunned, terrified faces, "will be State's Exhibit A in our prosecution of Mr. Keller for aggravated hate crimes. It may also, I assure you, form the evidentiary bedrock of a significant federal investigation into a pattern and practice of systemic civil rights violations, discriminatory enforcement, and institutionalized racism within the Goldenrod Estates Homeowners Association. Unless," she paused again, letting the full crushing weight of her words and the implications of the federal agents, now silently, impassively observing them, sink in. "This board and each of you individually is prepared to take immediate, unequivocal, substantive, and legally binding action to rectify this egregious, unconscionable situation, to cooperate fully, completely, and without reservation with all ongoing state and federal criminal and civil investigations, and to implement sweeping, verifiable, and permanent reforms to ensure that such an outrage, such a despicable abuse of power, such a blatant act of racist violence can never ever happen again within the jurisdiction of this community or under the auspices of this association." Shumpt. The confrontation was not loud, not overtly theatrical in the traditional sense of courtroom drama, but the undercurrent of raw, unassailable legal power of imminent, unavoidable, and potentially devastating personal and institutional annihilation was palpable, suffocating. The carefully constructed gilded facade of Goldenrod Estates' privileged insular autonomy, its arrogant belief in its own untouchability, had just been irrevocably, comprehensively shattered by the unblinking, unforgiving eye of a courageous nanny's cell phone camera, and by the unwavering, steely resolve of the state's attorney for civil rights. The falling action commenced with the immediate, unconditional, and almost comically abject surrender of the Goldenrod Estates Homeowners Association Board. Faced with the irrefutable, soul-searing video evidence, the grim, unwavering presence of federal agents, and the terrifying specter of devastating federal civil and criminal lawsuits, not to mention potential individual indictments for conspiracy and obstruction, Ms. Eleanor Vance and her shell-shocked colleagues crumbled like a house of cards in a hurricane. Officer Gary Keller, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning terror, was immediately formally and very publicly terminated from his position by a visibly trembling HOA vice president. Within the hour, Keller was arrested by state investigators from Simone Dubois' office, handcuffed and transported to the county detention center, charged with a battery of serious felonies, including aggravated assault as a hate crime, reckless endangerment of a child, and unlawful imprisonment. Ms. Eleanor Vance, her long and tyrannical reign as the undisputed iron-fisted queen of Goldenrod Estates, effectively and ignominiously over-resigned as HOA president by nightfall under intense pressure from her fellow board members and her own increasingly panicked legal counsel. She too faced an impending and likely devastating state and federal investigation into her role in fostering a culture of discrimination, her potential complicity in Keller's actions, and her subsequent attempts to obstruct justice. Jamal Carter, after being stabilized by paramedics with emergency oxygen and fast-acting bronchodilators, was rushed by ambulance to the nearest pediatric hospital. He spent 3 harrowing days in the intensive care unit, his young life hanging precariously in the balance as doctors battled to reverse the effects of the severe prolonged asthma attack and the near-fatal hypoxia he had endured. His physical recovery, when it finally began, was slow, painful, and arduous. His lungs, the doctors warned his anguished parents, were likely permanently scarred, his future respiratory health, uncertain, his vulnerability to future attacks significantly increased. The emotional and psychological wounds David and Maria Carter knew with a certainty that chilled them to the bone would take far longer, perhaps a lifetime, to heal. The image of Officer Keller's hate-filled face, the memory of his knee on his back, the agonizing sensation of suffocating would haunt Jamal's nightmares for years to come. Simone Dubois' Office of Civil Rights, in close coordination with the U.S. Department of Justice, launched a full-scale, top-to-bottom civil rights investigation into the Goldenrod Estates Homeowners Association. They unearthed a disturbing, deeply entrenched pattern of discriminatory housing practices, biased enforcement of community rules, targeting minority residents and families with disabled children, and a pervasive, insidious culture of racial intolerance and social exclusion that had been actively fostered, systematically protected, and ruthlessly enforced by Ms. Vance and her closest allies on the board for over a decade. Federal subpoenas were issued like confetti. Financial records were seized. Dozens of current and former Goldenrod Estates residents, many of whom had long suffered in silence, came forward with courageous, heartbreaking testimony detailing their own experiences with harassment, intimidation, and discrimination at the hands of the HOA leadership and its private security force. The meticulously documented picture that emerged was one of a community systematically, almost pathologically, attempting to marginalize silence and ultimately exclude anyone who did not conform to its narrow, rigidly defined, and blindingly white, homogeneous ideal. The state prosecution of Officer Gary Keller, personally overseen by Simone Dubois, was swift, relentless, and decisive. The bystanders' video, authenticated and entered into evidence, became the unassailable, emotionally devastating centerpiece of the government's case. Keller's desperate last-minute attempts to portray Jamal Carter as the aggressor, to claim that Jamal had been acting erratically and faking his asthma attack, were systematically brutally shredded by the calm, precise medical testimony of the paramedics and emergency room physicians who had saved Jamal's life, and by Keller's own hateful racist words, captured for eternity on that damning video. A jury visibly moved and horrified by the evidence took less than 2 hours to find Gary Keller guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to the maximum allowable term in state prison, a sentence that sent a clear, unequivocal, and long overdue message that abuse of power, racially motivated violence, and the callous disregard for human life, even when perpetrated by private security officers, cloaked in the flimsy authority of a homeowners association, would be met with the full, unyielding force of the law. The resolution of this shocking, heartbreaking, and ultimately transformative incident resonated far beyond the now notorious ornate gates of Goldenrod Estates, triggering significant sweeping statewide reforms. Spurred by the intense public outcry, the relentless media scrutiny, and the tireless, impassioned advocacy of Simone Dubois, the Carter family, and a broad coalition of civil rights organizations and disability advocates, the state legislature, in a rare display of bipartisan urgency, passed a comprehensive package of new laws, known collectively and fittingly as Jamal's Law. This landmark legislative achievement included mandatory statewide licensing, rigorous psychological screening, and extensive standardized training requirements for all private security personnel operating within the state. This training included comprehensive modules on constitutional and civil rights, implicit bias awareness and de-escalation techniques, crisis intervention strategies, disability sensitivity, and appropriate interaction protocols, and clear, strict limitations on the use of force arrest and detention powers, mirroring many of the standards required for sworn public law enforcement officers. Enhanced criminal penalties for assault battery, unlawful imprisonment, and civil rights violations committed by private security personnel acting under color of authority, effectively eliminating any ambiguity about their accountability under the law. The creation of a new independent statewide oversight board for private security agencies and HOA-employed security forces, vested with robust investigative authority, disciplinary powers, and the ability to decertify individuals and agencies found to be in violation of state law or professional standards. Strengthened state hate crime statutes to explicitly include offenses motivated by bias against individuals with disabilities and to provide enhanced protections and avenues for civil recourse for victims of such crimes. New regulations requiring HOAs to adopt transparent, non-discriminatory bylaws and enforcement procedures, and providing residents with clear, accessible mechanisms for reporting and redressing grievances related to harassment, discrimination, or abuse of power by HOA boards or their agents. The Goldenrod Estates Homeowners Association, facing financial ruin from multiple multi-million-dollar federal civil rights lawsuits filed by the Carter family and numerous other residents who courageously came forward detailing past abuses, effectively ceased to exist as a functional entity. Its insurance carriers dropped its coverage, its already tarnished property values plummeted, and a significant number of its residents, horrified by the revelations and disgusted by the community's toxic culture, put their homes up for sale. President Eleanor Vance, though she narrowly avoided direct criminal indictment for her role, due to a series of intricate, expensive legal maneuvers by her high-powered attorneys, faced professional ruin, public disgrace, and became a pariah in the very community she had once so ruthlessly, arrogantly dominated. She eventually sold her Goldenrod Estates mansion at a considerable loss and retreated into ignominious obscurity. Jamal Carter, with the unwavering, unconditional love and support of his remarkable family, and buoyed by the outpouring of support from his community and from across the nation, emerged from his horrific ordeal, not as a broken victim, but as a powerful, articulate, and inspiring young advocate for racial justice, disability rights, and an end to all forms of bullying and abuse of power. His quiet courage, his gentle dignity, and his unwavering resilience in the face of unimaginable trauma inspired countless others. He became a national youth ambassador for several civil rights and asthma awareness organizations, his voice a compelling testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. Simone Dubois, watching him address a national youth leadership conference in Washington, D.C. A year later, his voice clear and strong. His message, one of hope and unwavering determination, felt a profound, almost overwhelming sense of pride, not just in the successful prosecution of Gary Keller and the systemic reforms that had been achieved, but in the remarkable young man Jamal Carter had become. The fight for civil rights, she knew with every fiber of her being, was an endless, arduous marathon, not a sprint, a constant, often exhausting, and sometimes dangerous battle against the deeply entrenched forces of prejudice, ignorance, and systemic injustice. But in the incandescent resilience of young Jamal Carter, in the quiet courage of ordinary people like Isabella Rodriguez, who dared to speak out against wrongdoing, and in the transformative healing power of the law, when wielded with skill, integrity, unwavering determination, and an unshakable moral compass, lay the enduring, irrefutable promise of a more just, more equitable, and ultimately more compassionate society for all. The meticulously manicured, once arrogantly exclusive lawns of Goldenrod Estates would forever bear the invisible, indelible stain of that terrible Saturday morning. But they would also, Simone profoundly hoped, serve as a lasting, potent reminder that no gate, however ornate, is too high, no wall, however thick, too imposing to keep out the relentless, inexorable, and ultimately triumphant pursuit of justice.